in the shadowed halls of the Imperial Palace on Terra, beneath the watchful gaze of ancient statues and tapestries that told of 100 wars across 1,000 worlds, a single flickering lumen globe struggled to push back the darkness. The air was thick with incense, smoke drifting upward in lazy curls, hinting of centuries-old dust, solemn prayers, and the hush of secrets too dangerous to speak. Cloaked figures moved slowly through these corridors, custodians of knowledge and memory, each step echoing against walls that had witnessed the triumphs and tragedies of 1,000,000 souls. It was a place of reflection and of regret, for this was a universe in which the Emperor's vision had manifested in ways no one could have predicted, where the Sisters of Battle, the Adeptus Sororitas, had taken the place of the Space Marines as the Imperium's supreme warriors. History had turned upon a single point of divergence, an event so small that the scribes of the Adeptus Administratum would have dismissed it as inconsequential had its consequences not proven so monumental. Within the sequestered archives, where day bled into night, a solemn figure wearing the vestments of a canonist superior closed a massive tome. The book's title had worn away, but within its ancient pages lay the secret story of how the mightiest daughters of the Emperor ascended, and how the fabled Astartes had found themselves overshadowed. She recited a silent prayer to the Emperor, crossed her breast with the sign of the Aquila, and prepared herself to recall the revelations that had changed the course of humanity. Long ago, in those lost centuries known only in half-remembered myths and censored records, the Emperor had set forth to unite the warring human realms scattered across the galaxy. He forged a path of blood and glory, heralded by the monstrous warp storms that had threatened to consume all. In that fateful era, the Emperor had created the Space Marines, genetically enhanced warriors, giants among men, formed from the genetic legacy of the Primarchs, those demigod-like sons who bore aspects of the Emperor's own essence. The purpose was simple: to defend humanity from Xenos threats, to reunite scattered worlds under the Imperial banner, and to bring an age of enlightenment and reason. Yet as time marched forward, the seeds of discord were sown among the stars. Some of the Primarchs turned from their father, giving themselves over to corruption, forging the cataclysmic event known as the Horus Heresy. The galaxy burned, and though the Emperor was triumphant in the final, fatal confrontation, he was grievously wounded and consigned to the Golden Throne, sustained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers. In most versions of that dreadful epic, the Space Marines endured as the Imperium's chosen weapons, revered, feared, and unstoppable. But in this particular branch of reality, a subtle variation that many historians of the Ordo Chrono speculate could have been caused by the slightest shift in the tides of the warp, everything changed. This was a reality in which the Emperor, in his last moments of lucidity, recognized that a new force was required. Strength of body was essential, but so too was purity of soul, an unbreakable faith that would anchor the Imperium against the horrors of chaos. In the final instance of the heresy, with Horus lying broken at his feet, the Emperor uttered a dying command to form not just superhuman warriors, but an army of the faithful, exemplars of unwavering devotion that would resist the corruption that had nearly brought the Imperium to ruin. The seeds for such an order were already present in the ecclesiarchy. As the cult of the Emperor developed, worshipping him as a living god, though such worship had once been forbidden by the imperial truth, pious women of exceptional conviction stepped forward as protectors of the faith. They were the daughters of the Emperor, the proto-order that would become the Adeptus Sororitas. In that final moment, the Emperors will reshape their destiny. His last instructions, recorded in ephemeral runes that glowed on the throne for a heartbeat, declared that it would be these devout daughters who would carry humanity's future upon their shoulders. Once the ecclesiarchy realized the significance of these words, they arranged for advanced methods to empower the daughters of the Emperor with the genetic breakthroughs once reserved solely for the Space Marines. The process was not identical, for women's physiology required a variant of the gene seed, but the principle was the same: an elevated being, stronger, faster, and blessed with a spiritual resilience that was as potent as any physical enhancement. The Space Marines, battered and leaderless with their Primarchs scattered, found themselves overshadowed by the blossoming might of the new order's militant. A few among the Astartes bristled at this perceived usurpation, for it was their duty and right by blood and oath to be the Imperium's primary defenders. Yet the emperor's final command was beyond reproach, encoded into ecclesiarchy dogma and upheld by the high lords of Terra, who believed that pious women, shaped by fervent prayer, might be less prone to the heretical ambitions that had consumed so many of the primarchs. A transformation thus began, altering the fundamental balance of power throughout the Imperium. Within a single generation, the newly christened Adeptus Sororitas subfactions, such as the Order of the Bloody Rose, the Order of Our Martyred Lady, the Order of the Ebon Chalice, and countless others, became unstoppable. Their advanced gene forging, though initially controversial, produced exceptionally potent warriors. Where an unaugmented sister might have been a disciplined champion of faith, these new sororitas gained levels of physical prowess that rivaled or even surpassed a standard Astartes. More importantly, their unwavering devotion to the emperor formed a bulwark that chaos found incredibly difficult to breach. Their faith was anathema to demonic intrusion, their minds steel reinforced by daily litanies that each sister sang from the moment she awoke to her final prayers before entering suspended rest. Coupled with the advanced weapons and armor that once had been the hallmark of the Astartes, each sister of battle became an emblem of unstoppable holy wrath, a living sermon of vengeance in the emperor's name. Many in the Imperium believed this shift was a new dawn, a heresy as terrible as the one spearheaded by the favored son, Horus, would never again threaten mankind. The seeds of doubt were few. Most fell under the heel of the ecclesiarchy and the Ordo Hereticus, who were quick to denounce any suggestion that the reorientation of power might not wholly reflect the emperor's plan. Yet beyond the glow of Terra's ancient sun, in the wilderness space where Zeno's empires churned in hidden enclaves, enemies took note. And in the Empyrean, warp entities that had watched with malevolent glee as the sons of the emperor fell from grace now turned their hungry eyes to the daughters who had taken their place. Time passed, centuries layering upon centuries. The Imperium faced countless wars, battles on hive worlds so vast that entire continents lay under seas of architecture, crusades across black voids where human vessels were but specks of light amid cosmic storms. Through it all, the Sisters of Battle advanced. Wherever a new threat materialized, the Order's militant deployed, leading entire armies of Imperial Guard, Mechanicus war cohorts, and countless local defense forces. They became the spearheads, their faith forging them into unstoppable powers of unyielding righteousness. Like living saints upon the battlefield, they unleashed the Emperor's wrath, brandishing bolt guns inscribed with holy scripture, chain blades humming with the resonance of 1,000 orisons. They walked into the jaws of Tyrannid swarm fleets. They shattered orc war hordes by personally decapitating the largest war bosses. They stood unflinching before Tau railguns and Eldar trickery, never doubting the righteousness of their cause. And they gloried in the intangible shield of the Emperor's benediction, which they believed guided every bullet they fired. Yet the truth of the galaxy is never as simple as faith would wish it to be. Even as the Adeptus Sororitas dominated the stage of imperial might, the galaxy was not quiet. Forbidden cults formed in the depths of underhives, where half-starved men and women whispered that, for all their purity, the sisters were still mortal. Who among them might fall prey to hubris or mistaken zeal? On remote war fronts, certain sisters who had grown used to unstoppable victory found themselves tested. Conflicts with emerging horrors in the warp pushed the boundaries of sanity, while in the eastern fringe, ephemeral sightings spoke of strange alliances forming between the fractured Tau Empire and certain radical inquisitors. The Sisters of Battle suspected that behind every deviation from imperial dogma lurked the shadow of heresy. But with the Imperium larger than ever, even an army of righteous warriors found themselves stretched thin. The High Lords of Terra, for their part, found comfort in the knowledge that the Sisters, in all their powerful devotion, answered directly to the ecclesiarchy, an institution that championed unwavering loyalty to the emperor. Yet politics has a way of subverting even the holiest of intentions. Among the sisters themselves, rivalries took shape. The Order of the Bloody Rose, famed for their furious assaults and unstoppable aggression, clashed ideologically with the Order of the Sacred Shield, who believed that the emperor's will was best manifested in the defense of the righteous. Subtler tensions existed between the older, more traditional orders, who held fast to ancient doctrines, and the newly established ones, formed in the fires of more recent conflicts. Their power was immense, and so were their personalities, each sister shaped by a lifetime of rigor and an unbreakable will. The Sororitas were an unstoppable blade, yet a blade can be sharpened to such an extreme that it risks fracturing. In contrast, the Space Marines, those who still bore the gene seed of the Emperor's Primarchs, found themselves in a peculiar position. While once they were unstoppable legends, their mythic status had been slowly eroded by centuries of overshadowing from the New Order's militant. Certain chapters had disbanded entirely, or been folded into Sororitas-led crusades as specialized auxiliaries. A few proud chapters, like the Imperial Fists and the Ultramarines, sought to maintain a shred of their ancient glory, carving out realm protection deals with local sector lords or fortifying strategic bastion worlds. They fought valiantly where they could, but their numbers were smaller than ever, their recruits fewer, and their war gear overshadowed by the ecclesiarchy's favor granted to the Sisters of Battle. A rare few chapters, too proud to accept what they saw as a betrayal of their legacy, turned renegade, though not always toward chaos. Some disappeared into the dark corners of the galaxy to wage their wars against Xenos or heretics, unencumbered by the burdens of a once glorious Imperium that had seemingly forsaken them. Others, like the Black Templars in this alternate timeline, embraced the Sororitas as allies in faith, forging strong ties with the ecclesiarchy. Yet even that relationship was ultimately overshadowed by the fact that the sisterhood reigned supreme in matters of martial might and spiritual authority. Slowly, the Imperium of Man molded itself to this new paradigm. Ecclesiarchal architecture, always grand, now loomed on every world, its spires twisting heavenward like supplicating hands. The images of great sister saints replaced icons of Space Marine heroes. Stained glass windows in newly consecrated cathedrals depicted a sister holding aloft a burning blade, while the once-renowned legends of heroic Astartes were relegated to marginal notes in liturgical scrolls. The official line from Terra was that the Emperor's final wish had come to fruition. The Imperium was shielded by an incorruptible army of his most faithful daughters, and none dared question that dogma. Though the ecclesiarchy insisted that this was a golden age of purity, the truth was darker, for the galaxy teemed with resentments, nightmares, and endless perils. Chaos, having adapted after the heresy, still lurked in the warp, prowling like a ravenous beast. The four ruinous powers recognized that the sisters' faith was a formidable barrier. They developed subtler methods of infiltration, deceptions, illusions, and temptations that preyed on pride, on ambition, on the possibility that even the holiest might question their unstoppable position. Hidden wars took shape in the twisting paths of the warp, where demons schemed to fracture the Sororitas from within. And on distant battlefields, the remains of corrupted Astartes legions, now fewer in number but cunning in their cruelty, tested the sisterhood's mettle. It was upon one such battlefield that a drama of colossal significance unfolded. The planet was called Etheria by its inhabitants, a once prosperous imperial mining world situated near a chaotic warp storm that had effectively sealed it off from outside contact for decades. The newly formed Order of the Cleansing Pyre, led by Canoness Valentia Marchevsky, was assigned to reclaim Etheria in the Emperor's name. Reports indicated that the planet's population had fallen under the sway of a strange, heretical cult, possibly chaos-influenced. Eager to prove the worth of their newly created order, the sisters landed in force. Their dropships descended through a corrupted atmosphere tinted an ominous shade of purple, the warp storm's energies still raging. The Sororitas advanced wearing pristine power armor, each suit etched with the name of a martyred saint, each bolter loaded with specially sanctified ammunition. Hymns of purification blared from laud-hailers as they walked through scorched canyons littered with the remains of once thriving cities. Etheria's people had been twisted by years of isolation and the insidious influence of the warp. Pale-faced figures, chanting blasphemies in massed hordes, awaited the sisters behind makeshift barricades. Shadows stirred in the corners of broken spires, where mutant snipers or warp-tainted psychers waited for a chance to strike. Yet the sisters pressed forward. Their righteous fury manifested in tight formations, bolt guns roaring in disciplined volleys that pulverized cultists by the dozens. Flammers spouted holy promethium, purging entire blocks of horrors. Canoness Marchevsky, leading from the front, lifted her chainsword high, the weapon's teeth singing as they shredded heretics in a crescendo of blood and fire. The Astartes, who had been stationed on the fringes of this region, a small, beleaguered group calling themselves the Knights Adamant, observed the Sororitas from a distance. Once proud, now reduced in number and resources, the Knights Adamant wore battered ceramite that had not been repainted in generations. They saw the unstoppable tide of the sisterhood and felt a pang of both admiration and bitter envy. Their chapter master, Orjan Drake, had long been known for his stoic acceptance of the new reality, but even he could not fully hide the sorrow in his voice as he watched Canoness Marchevsky advance without fear. In times past, the Astartes had been at the forefront, storming enemy fortifications and shining as the Emperor's angels of death. Now it was the sisters who carried that august mantle. Some of Drake's men murmured about how they were unnecessary relics. Others fumed with resentment, harboring private fantasies of proving once and for all that the Astartes were not so easily replaced. Into these tensions marched the forces of chaos. A cult leader revealed himself, an emaciated figure with a rictus grin and horns twisting from his temples. His name was Helix the Prophet, and he had been shaped by the influence of Tsench, the architect of fate. With a voice of mesmerizing power, Helix summoned from the warp illusions and horrors that threatened to shatter even the Sororita's faith. Tentacles of shimmering, impossible color reached out from reality's cracks, and beast-like shapes coalesced out of shimmering motes. For the first time in living memory, an entire Sororita's formation faltered, battered by a barrage of psychic might. Canoness Marchevsky herself, though her faith was resolute, felt a gnawing doubt in the depths of her mind. A doubt that whispered of unfulfilled ambition, of the possibility that her glorious ascent might have left behind the true will of the Emperor. Sensing her hesitation, Helix the Prophet seized the moment. His voice rose in a macabre litany, and from the roiling warp storm overhead descended a greater demon of Tsench, a crow-headed monstrosity wreathed in crackling sorcerous flame. Its laughter shook the sky, and across the battered world, the rebellious cultists cried out in unholy ecstasy. The illusions tightened around the sisters, illusions that took the shape of old nightmares. Starship corridors twisting forever in labyrinths, the faces of beloved mentors accusing them of heresy, and, worst of all, the Emperor's visage turning away in scorn. Sister after sister felt the weight of that psychic assault pressing upon their hearts. Helms grew heavy, thoughts turned inward, and for a single catastrophic moment, even the unbreakable vow began to bend. It was as if the bonds of their vaunted faith were fraying. But the Emperor, ensconced upon the golden throne, had not abandoned them. In the darkest moment, a blazing light manifested on the battlefield. Saint Celestine, or a being who appeared as Celestine, soared downward with wings of living fire. Her sword carved through illusions as though slicing cobwebs, and her voice rang out in a song that wove each of the sisters' hearts back into unwavering harmony. The illusions shattered, revealing the cowering cultists and the snarling demon in their true, wretched forms. Renewed in faith, the Sororitas advanced once more, stepping over corpses with methodical, relentless strides. Bolters roared, and flammers belched holy promethium. Helix the Prophet shrieked as he realized his once certain victory was slipping away. In desperation, Helix pointed a clawed finger at the Knights Adamant, calling out to them through the warp, taunting them. He promised them power beyond measure, a chance to reclaim their rightful place as the Emperor's chosen. Could they not see how overshadowed they had become? Would they not fight for the legacy that had been stolen from them? Some of the Knights Adamant balked at such a transparent attempt at corruption, but others faltered. Pride, jealousy, and old wounds left them vulnerable. In an instant that threatened to unravel centuries of tradition, a handful of Astartes, desperate for recognition, advanced toward Helix's position, as though enthralled by the possibility that they might harness the warp for themselves and prove their superiority. In that moment, the Knights Adamant realized what they were about to become. Horror dawned on their faces as they recognized their almost betrayal. Shame warred with gratitude. Some turned from the battlefield entirely, unable to face their own weaknesses. but others felt a new spark within their gene-forged hearts, an admiration for these unstoppable sisters who would stand for them, protect them from themselves, and do so with unwavering faith. In a swirl of fury and flame, the combined might of the Adeptus Sororitas and the newly emboldened Knights Adamant advanced once more. Halix, cornered and enraged, unleashed the greater demon in a final assault, but Sister Celestine, or her living spirit, carved through the demon's heart with a blade wreathed in the Emperor's light, sending it screaming back into the warp. Halix himself was taken alive, bound in chains inscribed with wards of the Ordo Malleus, to be subjected to excruciating penance and interrogation that would likely end with a cleansing execution. With the world of Etheria pacified, the Sisters of Battle consecrated the planet's cathedrals once again. Great pyres burned day and night, destroying every symbol of heresy. Canoness Marchevsky led ceremonies that spanned a full week, ensuring that the warp storm over the planet receded. The Knights Adamant assisted in reconstruction, their leader Chapter Master Drake forced to reconcile with the raw truth. In this era, the Adeptus Sororitas truly were the Imperium's elite, the inheritors of the Emperor's final command. And yet, the sisters did not cast the Astartes aside. In an unspoken vow, Marchevsky and Drake recognized that each group, in its own way, was essential to the Imperium. Though the Emperor's last directive had favored the sisters, the loyal Space Marines were still children of the Emperor, shaped from the gene seed of the Primarchs, and they had their part to play. In the decades that followed Etheria's reclamation, a cautious renaissance of collaboration emerged in certain corners of the Imperium. The events on Etheria were whispered of throughout the sector, passed from confessional to confessional until they reached the ears of the ecclesiarchy. Some high-ranking clerics bristled at the notion that the sisters had chosen to work alongside Astartes who were so obviously tempted by heresy, but others saw an opportunity. Perhaps, they reasoned, the sisters' unwavering faith could become the shield that prevented any further corruption among loyalist Marines. Maybe the Astartes had a place, albeit secondary, under the guidance of the Sororitas. Unsurprisingly, not every sister or every Marine welcomed such an arrangement. There were those among the Sororitas who believed that any sign of weakness or corruption should be purged without mercy. Meanwhile, many proud Marines still believed that it was they who should lead crusades against the galaxy's countless threats, not these warrior nuns who had replaced them. Yet the High Lords of Terra saw an advantage in allowing some level of cooperation. As the Imperium grew and threats multiplied, a new wave of Black Crusades began emanating from the Eye of Terror, led by Chaos champions who had once been Prime Arc sons. The twisted reflection of the Space Marines still existed in the form of the traitor legions, cackling worshippers of the Dark Gods. Though smaller in numbers than in times past, they were cunning, adapted to millennia of guerrilla warfare, and hungry to topple the Imperium. With the Adeptus Sororitas standing as the Imperium's shield, it became clear that any loyal forces, including loyalist Marines, might be needed in the darkest hours. And so, though overshadowed, the Astartes were not wholly erased. They became an auxiliary of sorts, often acting under Sororitas' command in major campaigns, or undertaking specialized missions that required their genetic heritage, such as infiltration into chaos-held worlds where old protocols might only be recognized by gene seed carriers, or hunts for relics tied to the Primarchs. In some remote corners, a few chapters still clung to independence, forging alliances with local planetary governors and refusing to directly serve the ecclesiarchy. Tensions simmered, but the unifying impetus of survival against the galaxy's terrors kept a fragile peace. As the millennia turned, the Imperium under the stewardship of the Adeptus Sororitas changed in character. Devotion to the Emperor was at an all-time high. The ecclesiarchy's cathedrals rose across every major hive world, forging a sense of unity through worship. Pilgrimages became more common, with entire pilgrim fleets crossing the void to gather at sites where the sisters had won notable victories. The image of the Emperor as a father, cherished by his daughters, took center stage in holy rites. For many citizens of the Imperium, the sisters were living proof of the Emperor's unconditional love, for they were his chosen, unstoppable defenders. This spiritual atmosphere had its benefits. A renewed sense of hope bloomed in some systems, leading to brief periods of economic and cultural revival. Artists sculpted statues of heroic sisters, each figure crowned with a halo of gold and steel. A new canon of sacred music emerged, with entire Schola Progenium choirs singing the exploits of Sororita's saints. But where there is light, there is shadow. A deeper scrutiny revealed that many of these wonders were built on unspeakable cost. The Sororitas were devout, but also intolerant of any hint of deviation. Entire hive segments might be burned for harboring cults or witches. War zones left behind mountains of bodies, with entire populations forcibly brought back into compliance. The tithe of faith demanded by the ecclesiarchy was often exorbitant, draining planetary resources. The endless wars continued, as Xeno's empires tested the Imperium's will. One does not become the preeminent power in the galaxy without making enemies. The Eldar craft worlds, for example, saw the sisters as ephemeral zealots, unyielding in their expansions. The orcs always looked for a good fight, uninterested in faith but more than eager to challenge these apparently unstoppable she-warriors. The Tyranids, a threat beyond comprehension, devoured planet after planet, heedless of the ecclesiarchy's prayers. Despite these trials, the Sororitas endured. They believed, above all else, that the Emperor's protection guided them. Victory after victory vindicated their faith, and though they suffered grievous casualties, new generations of Schola Progenium initiates eagerly took up the bolter and flamer. Some sisters rose to prominence as living saints, rumored to bear miracles akin to those once attributed to the Prime Arcs. Unexplainable phenomena occurred around them, wounds that closed before the eyes of Medicae, walls of psychic flame that parted for the faithful, and the righteous fury that allowed a single sister to hold a pass against an entire horde of cultists. The ecclesiarchy seized upon these miracles to further enshrine the legitimacy of the Sororitas as the Emperor's chosen. In the hearts of the faithful, the distinction between the Emperor and his daughters blurred. The Emperor was their father and ultimate deity, but the sisters were his arms and voice, an extension of divine will. While the Astartes had once been lauded as angels of death, the Sororitas took that angelic imagery and wove it into a tapestry of motherhood, sisterhood, and daughterhood that resonated across humanity. The Imperium took on a matriarchal caste, with the ecclesiarchy's highest echelons dominated by canonesses, abbesses, and female clergy. Although men still served in many roles, from the Imperial Guard to the Inquisition, the heart of the Imperium's war machine was feminine and fervent. Word of these developments slowly reached out to the scattered Prime Arcs. Yes, they still existed in this timeline, though most had vanished millennia before. Some had disappeared into the warp, others were rumored to be in stasis or wandering the galaxy in disguise. The ruinous powers had claimed some as champions, twisted reflections of their father's legacy. Occasionally, rumors circulated of a Prime Arc returning to rally forces against a new threat, but inevitably these stories either proved false or ended in heartbreak. The galaxy was not kind to legends. Now, the idea that the Emperor had replaced his sons with his daughters spread in hushed rumors. Some loyal Prime Arcs, if they survived, might have felt pride in seeing the Imperium endure, even thrive. Others might have felt bitterness or confusion. The traitor Prime Arcs, for their part, raged at the sisters' purity, seeing in them an even more stubborn bulwark against the infiltration of chaos. In the Eye of Terror, rancorous celebrations of violence echoed as the Chaos Legions plotted new ways to break the Imperium from within. For all their success, the Sororitas remained only human, albeit genetically bolstered and fanatically devoted. Over time, cracks inevitably formed. Not all sisters had the same measure of unassailable belief. Some questioned the extremes to which they went to enforce purity. Others worried that centralizing so much power in the ecclesiarchy risked overshadowing the Emperor's original dream of a rational, enlightened Imperium. These quiet doubts rarely erupted into open dissension, but there were rare cases. A few sisters turned rogue, unthinkably renouncing the ecclesiarchy or forging deals with radical inquisitors who used Xenotech or daemon hosts to combat the greater evils lurking in the stars. The sisterhood's greatest strength, its unwavering uniformity, could become a vulnerability if any dissent took root. Behind the scenes, the Inquisition watched warily. The Ordo Hereticus, in particular, was tightly intertwined with the sororitas, but even they needed to ensure that the sisterhood never grew so dominant that it overshadowed all forms of imperial governance. The question whispered in hidden corners was this: what would the Imperium do if the sororitas as a whole ever lost their way? Who could stand against them? The Astartes, once that counterbalance, were diminished. The Imperial Guard? Brave but mortal, reliant on training and firepower that might not suffice if the unstoppable sisters ever turned on them. Such speculation remained taboo, yet the fear lingered. And so the Imperium carried on through the long nights of the 41st millennium and into the next. Black ships arrived bearing psychers for sacrifice to the Emperor, ensuring the Golden Throne's continued operation. Planetary governors made elaborate pledges of loyalty, praying that their tithes would avert the devastating arrival of a sororitas purge. In the Schola Progenium, young girls chanted the names of holy saints, reciting the litany that would become their daily routine if they passed the rigorous screening. The sisters who advanced to full membership underwent gene-forging processes reminiscent of the old Astartes programs, though heavily modified for the female biology. Implants were followed by psycho-indoctrination sessions so intense that entire blocks of memories were sometimes erased or rewritten to ensure unwavering loyalty. Each sister would come away from these trials steel-spined and resolute, her body turned into a weapon, her mind a cathedral of faith. In time, the sororitas' sphere of influence extended beyond the realm of war. They advised planetary governors, shaped policy within the ecclesiarchy, and even influenced trade and exploration. Some amongst the more intellectual orders, such as the orders Dialogus or Famulus, ventured into the territory of knowledge management, ensuring that only that which was deemed righteous and safe made its way into the hands of the populace. Exploration vessels traveling into unknown territories often carried detachments of sororitas, not just to protect the expedition, but to ensure that any discovered knowledge or artifacts were immediately subjected to ecclesiarchy scrutiny. This was not a cause for discontent among the masses. For them, it was normal that the Emperor's daughters, paragons of virtue, would safeguard humanity from the galaxy's lurking evils. Yet in hushed circles, tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus sometimes bemoaned how zeal overshadowed scientific inquiry. The Mechanicus' own relationship with the sisterhood was delicate. The sororitas appreciated the Mechanicus for forging weapons of holy war, but the ecclesiarchy never forgot that the Mechanicus worshipped the Omnicia, a practice that straddled the line between acceptable veneration and potential heresy. Careful balancing acts became the hallmark of imperial governance. Still, the galaxy was not kind enough to allow the Imperium a quiet reign. The Tyranid hive fleets increased their incursions, more cunning and adaptable than before. One such incursion threatened the Segmentum Solar itself, and the Adeptus Sororitas rallied in unstoppable waves. Fleets of black and gold ships poured forth from Terra, each vessel carrying thousands of sisters, ready to defend the throne world at all costs. The war that followed was of an unprecedented scale, with entire systems sacrificed to slow the advance of the ravenous swarm. On the front lines, Sister Superior Aurelia of the Order of the Argent Shroud led a valiant stand on the fortress world of Helion III. The planet was overrun by biotitans and the seething masses of Gaunts. Yet Aurelia's faith burned so fiercely that it seemed the warp itself recoiled. Sisters fought in the labyrinthine trenches, driving back wave after wave of aliens with bolter fire and roaring chainswords. Holy incense mixed with the acrid stench of Tyranid ichor, creating a miasma that turned Helion III's atmosphere into a toxic haze. Through it all, the sisters persevered. And when the last stand came, Aurelia herself stood on the battlements, reciting the Emperor's prayer until her voice was ragged. Then, in a moment that etched itself into the annals of the ecclesiarchy, a brilliant light enveloped Helion III's fortress. When the glare receded, the Tyranids lay charred in a circle of ash around Aurelia, who lived still, her eyes shining with a radiance that seemed borrowed from a higher power. Reinforcements arrived soon after, turning the tide. The system was saved, and Aurelia was declared a living saint on the spot. News of this miracle spread across the Imperium like wildfire, igniting an even stronger wave of devout worship. The sisterhood had proven not merely unstoppable in body, but capable of harnessing wonders that rivaled or surpassed the warp powers of chaos. Indeed, it seemed that the Emperor himself performed miracles through them, validating once more that they were the rightful heirs to his ultimate legacy. The celebration of Aurelia's ascension, however, was not universal. A small but fervent group of Astartes from the Shadowsworn chapter, stationed nearby during the conflict, felt a new bitterness. They saw what had happened on Helion III and resented that their own valor was overshadowed by a single sister's miracle. Though they recognized the importance of unity in the face of the Tyranid threat, many among them questioned whether the Emperor was truly working through the Sororitas or if some warp phenomenon was at play, cleverly disguising itself as divine intervention. Their chapter master, a grim veteran called Veritas, decided to keep these doubts internal, lest the Ordo Hereticus hear of such potentially heretical talk. But a seed of suspicion had been planted. In the wake of Helion III, countless pilgrimages to the fortress world became an annual event. Statues of Saint Aurelia sprang up in cathedrals across the Imperium. The ecclesiarchy seized upon the event as undeniable proof that the sisters had succeeded where the Emperor's sons had fallen short. Their dogma became more rigid. Some historians would later claim that this was the tipping point, the moment the Sororitas' dominance became so total that the Imperium's fate was inseparably bound to them. A handful of radical inquisitors worried about what might happen should that unstoppable power one day slip from the Emperor's grace. But for the moment, the Imperium reveled in its victories. The dominion of the faithful, some called it, an age of unstoppable daughters. Yet the warp is fickle and chaos never sleeps. Far from the protective radiance of Terra, in the barren wastes of the Segmentum Obscurus, the traitor legions were stirring once again. Bolstered by the worship of countless cults, the Black Legion, Word-Bearers, and other twisted remnants laid cunning plans. Abaddon the Despoiler, or in this timeline an entity that surpassed even him, orchestrated a new Black Crusade that aimed not merely at Terra, but at the heart of the Sisterhood's faith. Their strategy was insidious. Spread seeds of deception that would question the authenticity of the Sororitas' miracles, plant warp sorcery that mimicked the Emperor's power, and then, at a crucial moment, unveil the truth, cracking the Sisterhood's morale. Conspiracies took shape in the shadows, with chaos cults forging alliances with disgruntled humans, some among them Astartes who had turned renegade out of jealousy. Meanwhile, the Sisterhood prepared. Armored columns rolled out from fortress convents. The black-robed silent orders chanted unsleeping prayers in vigil. The Order's Hospitaller healed the wounded by the thousands, while the Order's Dialogus distributed saintly propaganda across the stars. Fleets mobilized in greater numbers than ever. War was coming, an all-consuming, apocalyptic event that might settle the fate of the Imperium once and for all. In the face of that threat, many realized that unity was paramount. Rivalries were set aside. The Knights adamant, reformed in spirit and eager to redeem themselves for their near fall on Etheria, volunteered for suicidal missions behind enemy lines. The sisters grudgingly accepted their assistance, albeit with an ever-watchful eye. Across the galaxy, pockets of loyalists, from the Imperial Guard to the Mechanicus, flocked under the Sororitas' banner, forging a coalition of the faithful that dwarfed anything seen since the earliest days of the Imperium. And so the scene was set for a cataclysmic confrontation. The warp storms around the Eye of Terror churned, spitting out a demonic armada. Demon Primarchs, those prime arcs twisted by chaos, rose once more to lead vile legions. They came to strike at the Sisterhood's shining example, determined to prove that faith could be corrupted just as easily as gene seed. The Sororitas, aware of the incoming storm, steeled themselves for the final test. Millions of sisters pledged their lives. The ecclesiarchy declared a holy war of unprecedented scale, calling it the Nova Ecclesia Crusade. It was rumored the Emperor's spirit stirred upon the Golden Throne, ignited by the unwavering devotion of his daughters. When at last the forces clashed, the galaxy itself seemed to groan under the weight of conflict. Battlefronts spanned entire sectors. World after world burned in the crossfire of fanatical sorority legions and infernal chaos hordes. The warp bled into real space, flooding battlefields with impossible landscapes of living nightmare. Sister Celestine was said to appear on a dozen fronts simultaneously, guiding the faithful. Saint Aurelia led a massive fleet action in orbit over the shrine world of Chrysanthemum, where the Black Legion sought to desecrate the tombs of ancient sister saints. After years of brutal combat, the final confrontation of the Black Crusade arrived around the Eye of Terror itself. The Sisterhood, in a bold maneuver, decided to take the fight into the storms swirling about the accursed region, aiming to strike at the demonic strongholds that had menaced the Imperium for millennia. Entire battle fleets, each commanded by a canonist preceptor, thrust into warp-touched space. The Imperium roiled with fury, attacking the ships with torrents of psychic horrors. But each vessel was lined with chapels upon chapels, manned day and night by chanting sisters who turned their collective faith into a psychic bulwark that deflected the warp's onslaught. The storms parted just enough for the Sisterhood's vessels to breach the outskirts of chaos-held worlds. On a twisted planet that was once an imperial colony, the sisters faced the heart of the chaos invasion, a fortress city shaped from black stone, pulsing with the essence of the warp. Here, the traitor prime arcs had gathered, along with innumerable cultists, demons, and war machines. Gargoyles carved from living bone leered from ramparts. Rivers of blood bubbled across a tortured landscape. Under a sky that churned with multicolored lightning, the final battle commenced. Orbital bombardments shook the planet's crust, exterminating entire legions of lesser demons. Drop pods crashed down, delivering squads of Sororitas armed with relic weaponry. Their songs filled the rancid air, turning each step into a condemnation of chaos. Flame tanks rolled forward, spouting infernos that purified the corrupted terrain. Canonesses bellowed orders, and the unstoppable host advanced. The traitor prime arcs met them with fury. Demon princes soared overhead, launching storms of warp fire. The planet's citadel erupted with living artillery, summoning ephemeral towers that fired shards of pure hate. Sisters died in droves, but each death only seemed to ignite more fervor in those who remained. Martyrdom had ever been a clarion call for the Sororitas, and in these final, cataclysmic hours, their faith reached a crescendo. A radiant aura enveloped entire battalions of sisters, a phenomenon that defied logic. Bolter shells glowed with white-hot intensity, smiting even heavily armored demon engines. Chain blades vibrated at frequencies that could sunder the warp-forged plating of Chaos Champions. The warp roiled with contradictory energy, battered by the manifestation of pure belief. In a moment that would be retold on 1,000 worlds, Canoness Marchevsky led a final assault on the fortress gates themselves. Marching under banners that sparkled with ethereal fire, she and her retinue cast themselves against the fortress's main portal. When her chain fist punched through, it allowed a flood of sisters inside. The fighting was savage, hallways twisting impossibly, foes emerging from the walls like nightmares. Yet the Sororitas pressed on, driven by the conviction that they carried the Emperor's will. In the throne room, a cyclopean chamber wreathed in vile incense, the final confrontation erupted. A traitor prime arc, once beloved by the Emperor, now a monstrous demon lord, roared his challenge. Marchevsky confronted him in single combat. Blade met claw, faith met warp. The prime arc's unnatural strength battered her aside more than once, fracturing her armor, but never her spirit. Every time she fell, she rose again, chanting the Emperor's name. With each strike, she felt the Emperor's presence, a whisper in her mind that drowned out pain and fear. The prime arc summoned illusions of the past, mocking her with visions of the heresy, of the Emperor's struggle, of the heartbreak that had once broken the Astartes. But Marchevsky had been tempered in the fires of devotion. She countered with images of the unstoppable sisterhood, of the countless worlds saved in the Emperor's name, of the billions who placed their hope in this new order. And in a final cataclysmic blow, her blessed power sword, shimmering with an impossible brilliance, cleaved through the prime arc's corrupt flesh. With a howl that shook reality itself, the demon prime arc fell into a rift of swirling warp energy, banished, at least for the moment, back to the hellish realm from which he had emerged. Outside, the fortress began to crumble, the warp losing its grip on the planet as the keystone of corruption was broken. The sky began to clear, revealing an endless darkness dotted with unfamiliar stars. The Black Crusade, deprived of its mightiest champions, collapsed in upon itself. Demon armies dissolved into ephemeral dust. Cultists turned upon each other in desperate fear. Across the battlefront, the Sisterhood stood victorious. Their unbreakable faith had proven mightier than the warp. The Imperium erupted in celebration, cathedrals ringing their bells day and night. A wave of religious euphoria swept the galaxy. The Emperor's daughters had again proven unstoppable, warding off the greatest threat since the Horus Heresy. Yet victory came at a price. Scores of worlds lay in ruins. In the skies above Terra, an armada of Sororita's warships formed a ceremonial procession, each vessel broadcasting hymns that echoed across the void. On every planet, shrines were built to commemorate the unstoppable faith that had banished the traitor Primarch. Paintings and tapestries immortalized the moment of Marchevsky's victory, depicting her as an avenging angel wreathed in golden flame. The entire Imperium stood in awe, reminded once again that the sisters were not merely replacements for the Emperor's sons, but perhaps the final evolution of his legacy, a fusion of gene-wrought strength and absolute spiritual conviction that no force in the galaxy could match. In the High Council chambers of Terra, the Abbess Sanctorum led a solemn gathering of the Ecclesiarchy and the High Lords. The question on every lip was, what next? The Imperium had survived yet another apocalyptic threat. The galaxy, though scarred, still teemed with challenges. Xenos empires, warp storms, hidden cults, and the ever-present risk of infiltration or corruption. But the Sisterhood had proven again and again that they would stand as the bulwark, unstoppable so long as their faith remained pure. The cost had been incalculable in blood and suffering, but such was the reality of a galaxy in perpetual war. The Abbess, robed in black and gold, made it clear. The Imperium would continue its vigilance, forever watchful for the next threat. The Ecclesiarchy's power would remain absolute, for it was guided by the Emperor's final directive and sanctified by the unstoppable might of the Sisters of Battle. In that silent moment, as the council adjourned, a hush fell across the throne room where the Emperor sat, still upon the golden throne. The living Emperor, or what remained of him in this timeline, offered no visible sign of approval or regret. Yet those with a sixth sense for the warp might have felt the faintest ripple of satisfaction, or perhaps acceptance. The Imperium he had forged was not exactly as he once envisioned. Gone was the dream of a purely rational empire united by logic and truth. Instead, a theocracy ruled by unbreakable warrior women had taken its place. But it was a humanity that continued to survive, to fight back the darkness, to expand among the stars. An Imperium that had faced the horrors of chaos and endured. One might argue that, in the grim darkness of the far future, that alone was a cause for hope. And so the galaxy turned, eon after eon, with the Sisters of Battle at its helm. Their bolters sang, their flammers roared, their voices chanted paeans to the Emperor with every sunrise. They marched across the stars, unstoppable in their devotion, unstoppable in their wrath, forging ahead in the name of the God Emperor who had chosen them above all others. The Space Marines, once the very symbol of the Imperium's might, found themselves forever in the shadow of the Sisterhood, yet still a loyal, if humbled, part of the grand tapestry of humanity. The warp, though restless, could not fully break the shield of unwavering faith, and so the Imperium persisted. In the end, no one truly knew if this was the future the Emperor had intended when he first crafted the Primarchs and the Astartes, or if it was a desperate gambit born of the tragedy of the heresy. What was certain was that the sisters had proven their worth. By the Emperor's last decree, they stood as his strongest weapon, forging a path of glorious conquest and martyrdom in an unending war that would last until the stars themselves died. And in this new age of the Imperium, an age of unshakable faith and unstoppable might, the Sisters of Battle reigned supreme, carrying the torch of humanity's survival through the endless night of a galaxy at war.